Hi, my name is Charlie Fairbairn and I am on the Pro No Coders team for FlutterFlow. Today I'm going to embark upon a tutorial that should take someone from a beginner standard to something more intermediate, even covering some fairly complex subjects. Tonya, the founder of Pro No Coders, has provided us with a scope, which is a description that might come from a client as to exactly what they want. So it's our job during this tutorial to develop that application. This is a very good discipline to get into because it mocks the real life situation where a client might come to you and say, here is the specification of my application, please build it for me. So the scope looks a bit like this. Well, at least the screenshots do. There's much more detail behind it, and as we go along, we're going to cover those two instructions about what buttons should actually do and the purpose of each page. But we can get a good feel for what we're trying to design here. Now, if we take, say, a relatively simple page at the beginning, which is this home page. We're going to start with that, and we can see there are various elements to it. We've got an image over here. We've got some text. We've got an email address over here that's probably going to need validation, and we're going to have a button here that's going to do something, probably add somebody to the database so that we can perhaps send them a newsletter. So without much further ado, let's begin. When you first sign up for FlutterFlow, you're likely to come to this page at the beginning, and we're going to create a new project over in the top right-hand corner. We're going to call the project Who Tutorial, and it's going to be a blank project. Now, when you first start a project, it's going to ask you to do various things to set up the project. Firstly, we're giving it the same name as we started off with. Here, it's filled out my company as this package name. There's no harm in changing that right at the beginning. It tends to get stuck when you start building Android applications and iPhone applications. And we're going to set up Firebase, which is an important step that is best done at the beginning to get it out of the way. So the first thing it's going to ask us for is a Firebase project ID. So we're going to have to shoot over to Firebase and take a look at how we're going to do that. Now, there are existing very good tutorials about how to do this. If you were to search, for instance, setting up the actual Google account, it's made very, very simple. And I'm not going to cover tutorials that have been done extremely well by other people. But if you get that stage right, then you're going to end up with a screen a bit like this. You can see that I've got other projects that I have been working on over there, and we're going to add a new project. We're going to give the project a name which might as well be similar to the one that we had before. So we'll just go Who Tutorial. And I'm going to ignore that message over there, and we're going to continue. And the first thing it's going to ask us is what other things do we want to set up. At this moment in time, we don't really want to set up anything. It's just overcomplicating. We can come back to that later. And we're going to create the project. That does take about a minute. I'm just going to put us on hold while that works. Okay, that's happened. And so we're going to continue into that, and the project is going to open up. This is the page you're going to be confronted with right at the beginning, and I tend to like to add the basics of what we need. We need Cloud Firestore, so we're going to click that button, and it's going to add the database. Now, this is the database that holds smallish kinds of information. We're going to have another one called Firebase Storage, where we store larger files such as images and videos. Here, we're going to create a database. And here we're going to start in test mode. We're going to change that later on. It's actually going to give it very little security to start off with, but we're going to cover that later in the tutorial. This is the recommended setup in the FlutterFlow instructions that I'm going to show you in a minute. You need to choose a region. That happens to be close to me, so that's fine. And on a good day, this will simply open up a view of the actual database. And voila. that is exactly what we want to see. A collection is the same as a table, and we can add fields to that within FlutterFlow. We're not going to do anything like that quite yet because we've got another very important stage to do. What I'd like you to do is to head over to the FlutterFlow docs over here at this URL and to search for the Firebase setup. You will come to some instructions like this, and this is really what I'm going to follow. Now, we've done some of the first ones already just a moment ago, but I did want to cover one of the more complicated ones, which, if we scroll down here, is enable access to your project. So the instructions are extremely good, but I'm going to run through them because they can be a little bit daunting if you're new to Firebase. So it's giving us the instructions. Project settings, go to users and permissions. So let's go and do that. Here we are in the project overview. We're going to go to users and permissions. And we need to add a member, and that member is Firebase at flutterflow.io, and in the instructions it tells us to change that to an editor. Okay, after a couple of seconds it will have added the member as an editor. The second part is this button down here, Advanced Permissions and Settings. Okay, we're here. They're asking us to edit the Firebase at flutterflow.io. So hit that little pencil button and it's asking us to add another role. In fact, we're going to add 2 more roles, and we're just simply going to follow the instructions. Okay, so there it is. The first one we need to add is service account user. So over here, select a role, and we can filter up here as service account user, and it would help if I didn't typo that. It'll give us several options there, but if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see there's server account user. So we're going to click on that and we're going to add that role. We're going to add another role. This one is called Cloud Functions Admin. And this time I'm going to copy it so I don't make any typos. Again, select a role. Let's paste that in. And there it is. Cloud Functions Admin. So we're going to select that user. Sorry, that permission. Okay, we're going to save all of that. Updating. Policy updated. Seems to have been successful. We can now shoot back to FlutterFlow again and see if we can connect to that database. So here we are back in the project setup, and we're going to see if we can connect to it. The moment of truth. Bingo, we've done. Now, if you missed out that step of adding the roles, then that's not going to connect, and it won't until you have done. Now, let's just scoot down a little bit here. Are we going to enable authorization? The answer is yes, because we're going to have users logging in. So let's enable that. And as soon as we do enable that, there's going to be a couple more things going on over here, as it wants us to set an initial page. I accidentally clicked that twice and taking it off again. I want to click each of these on, and we do want to create a user collection. So what does it mean by entry page? Well, if you imagine there's going to be a page that the user's going to see if they're not logged in, and as soon as they log in, it's going to go across and bring up the logged in user. Now, we haven't created any pages yet, but if we do press that button, FlutterFlow is quite helpful, and it'll ask us to set up an initial page, and we're going to create a blank page, and we're going to call that home. Seems sensible. It's also in the scope, by the way, and that's going to be a blank page, and it'll come back, and we're going to create that page. It's going to come back, and we're also going to do the same for the page after login. So we're going to set that here. Also going to be a blank page. Going to call that profile. It's part of the scope, and we're going to create blank. Create page. Okay. Now I think we can get to the fun part, which is to start building. So let's hit the start building button. And this is the screen that we're confronted with. Now, the first thing that you'll notice is that this is set up from the viewpoint of a mobile phone. We can quite easily change that up here so that that we're working to a UI design that is of different sizes. We've got a tablet over here, and we can choose from different ones, and we can also choose a desktop, which is the widest of them all. Now, I'm going to choose that because many of the screenshots that we've been given are actually in the full width web version of the application, so it doesn't matter which one of these we choose. We're going to choose this one. Now, FlutterFlow is adaptive, which means that it will alter the screen layout depending on what the viewport is. So there are various tricks to that, which I'm going to show you, but we're going to do that later. We're going to first get a page or two sorted out from this perspective, and then go and have a look at it and see what it looks like if we shrink it down to a tablet. And usually the problems start when we try shrinking down to the mobile viewport. Things get a bit cramped and we need to rearrange the layout. Now, you'll notice over here that we've got a page title. We probably want to get rid of that, and it's also saying drag elements into this column. Now, let's just have a quick run through of everything that's on this page. Now, the first thing that I've noticed up here is that we've got a red dot. That means that there's something wrong with the Firebase setup, and I know now that I have missed out a step. So usually you can just click on that, and what I think we failed to do was to also generate these config files. I think I'll find that if I do that step within Firebase, it is going to get rid of those errors. So there's a little tip that most of the time, if you see an error, click on the error and it'll take you to where it considers that error to be. Okay, I've done that, and you notice now that we have one warning. Now we're here, we notice that the Firebase storage and the usage for that has not been deployed as yet, but we're going to come back to that. Okay, so to go back to the design view that we were on a moment ago, we're going to run through from right to left the options that we have. At the far right top hand corner here, we've got various ways of running the application, from the very most basic simple one, which is this red eye over here. This will not create anything particularly functional, but it's a good way of checking out the layout, and it only takes about 5 seconds, 10 seconds to give you a good view of what your app looks like. But as I say, nothing's going to work. The second one is the run button over here. Now, run will create a completely functional web version of your application. However, it is not easily editable on the fly. Now, the best one that to use is this test button. Now, the test button will literally allow you to make minor changes, even major changes for that matter, in the design of your layout. Press a button and it will make those changes within about 5 to 10 seconds. Now, because this takes quite a lot of resources from FlutterFlow, one only gets 28 minutes on each session before one has to start a new session, and the build of your application to get to that point will take about 3 to 4 minutes, 2 to 4 minutes, I think they say, but it is still a very good way of developing. We've got developer options over here, which allow us to do some more complicated things. We can actually view the Flutter code there. Now, FlutterFlow is a user interface for the Google supported language of Flutter, which is why this tool is so powerful. GitHub, we're not going to cover that now. Download the code, we're not going to cover that now. Download the APK. Well, this will actually create a installable APK file that you can put on an Android phone. Possibly the best way of really understanding how an application is going to feel and look is if it's on a real mobile phone, and that's how you would do that there. Now, we've covered some of the error bugging over here. One thing that is extremely powerful about FlutterFlow is that if you make a mistake and you can either use Control Z to go back a stage, and it'll let you go back quite a few stages. Sometimes, though, you really just can't go back far enough, and that's where the snapshots come in. Every few minutes, the FlutterFlow servers will take a snapshot of your project, and it'll give it a timestamp, and from that you can decide how far back you want to go. Now, if you don't know how far back you want to go, you can go and peek at the project, and it'll open it up. It'll go and have, it'll show you how the project looked, say 20 minutes ago, or yesterday, or even the beginning of the week. So a very powerful way of making sure that you don't make, that you can go back to a copy of your application if something goes wrong. And there it is, the application. You can go and play around, have a look at that, and if you think that's the one that you want to return to, then that is a very, very good way of doing it. Now, going back into the actual project they're working on, we're moving towards the left. We are not going to cover everything here. These are various ways that one can access quickly some of the shortcut commands and a few other things over here. Now, the most important menus are over here on the very left-hand side, and they tend to go in a hierarchical order, which is the least used ones, or the ones that are most fundamental, are down at the bottom here. So we've already had a look briefly at the settings, and we'll pop in there for a second. Now it's returned to the page that we were on before when we were setting up Firebase, which would come under the Firebase menu option over here. You can see that there are also quite a few more complex things that can be set up from here. For instance, Google Maps needs an API key. We've got AdMob, Angolia, GitHub. You can even use a different database as the standard database, which is Superbase, but I'm not going to cover that here. Various payment systems, so all very exciting. Push notifications can automatically be set up, and you can also see from here the platforms that FlutterFlow is capable of automatically generating. It has Android and iOS done automatically, and at some point will enable the web as well. It'll tend to slow down the build a little bit, so I'm going to leave that to a little bit later. Moving swiftly on up here, we've got our design palette. This would allow you to create a color scheme and a design scheme, and it has some other very powerful features within it, which is where one can design, say, a form or a button, and just then copy and paste that design whenever you create a new button, so that you don't have to mess around with the color scheme or things like that. Typography and icons, this is where we decide the fonts, pretty normal stuff. The color scheme over here, and the design system. Please note that when it does say import Figma theme, it doesn't mean a Figma layout. Some people have asked me that. You can design the color scheme in Figma, but as of yet, you couldn't design, say, an interface in Figma and have that translated into a page in FlutterFlow. Now, we're not going to cover custom widgets and actions yet, but it allows you to write Flutter directly into FlutterFlow. So if there are functions there that you want to, if you want to extend the functionality of your application, writing in the Google supported Flutter language, you can. Media assets, if you want to hold images and pictures and such as those actually in the APK file rather than perhaps accessing it from the web, that's where you would do it. The API is a very good way of connecting to APIs. For instance, if you wanted to draw the weather, if you were creating a weather application, you might connect yourself to weather.com API. We're not going to cover what the app state is here, because we're going to cover something which really almost replaces the app state, which is the page state, which is where we hold variables on a page. The data types assists us in being able to organize our database. Over here we have access to the actual database, and if you remember, we asked it to set up the user table for us. Again, we're not going to cover that right yet, but that is what that button does. We've got a storyboard. Now we've got 2 pages, so that's going to look extremely boring, but that'll give you a layout from, if you press that button, what page that it will go to. Now we're starting to get to the more important page, this section of it, the 3 that we're going to be using a lot. The pages, and this is where we simply can add a new page. And as you can see, we've got 2 blank ones that have been set up in the setup process at the moment. That's all we've got. And we're going to be working initially on the home page. Up here is possibly the most important section of FlutterFlow, which is the widget tree. And on the widget tree, this basically defines the layout of your application, and we're going to do that in a minute. So we're going to see why it's a place to come to very often during the development of your application. And then up here, possibly the most exciting part of FlutterFlow is this absolute myriad, this library of pre-configured chunks of code that are called widgets or elements that can literally be just dragged across onto the page, sized and rearranged. And down here on the left hand side, there'll be tons of different parameters that you can play around to get it to do exactly what you want. Now that's actually what we're going to be doing, but we're going to start here on the widget tree. Now it has started the page off for us in a way that it thinks we would want it, which was the first thing from the home page is to create a column. So that means that everything that we add onto that is going to go vertically. And then it's also added an app bar at the top. Now we don't have that app bar in the scope. So I'm just going to hit the delete button on my computer. And that's how simple it is to get rid of that. We've now just got a column going on, into which we're going to drag, at the first instance, some containers, and I'm going to show you why. Okay, let's just remind ourselves of the page we are wanting to design. We've got a black border, top and bottom, and the black border is really just a placeholder, because if we look at the scope in detail, we'll see that we're going to have a menu going on up at the top here, and we're going to have some other stuff going on at the bottom here. But the reason why I've put this black border in to replicate the image that I'm working on is because if I don't think the dimensions of the page are going to look quite right, given all the different viewports that we're going to be designing for the desktop, the tablet, and the mobile phone. We've got a page that's split into 2 halves. On the left hand side we have an image. On the right hand side we have various kinds of text leading down to an email address, text input box, which is an email address. Therefore, we're probably going to need to validate that address. And we've got a button over here which says join the list. That is probably going to be an action that's going to add that person's email address to the database so that we can do things like send them an email or send them a newsletter. So, going back to our project. Now we're going to add our first container to this page. Now there are 2 ways of doing it. We can either go up to the widgets menu over here, and you'll see they put the container quite near the top, and that's because it's used so often. And in that instance we can just drag it across onto the page. And there it is at the top. I prefer not to do it that way, and I think it's quicker to do it this way. So I'm going to delete that. You see that it's in green. I just had to hit the delete button and it's going to vanish. I prefer to do it from the widget tree because it gives me a clearer vision of how it is structured. So the second way of doing it is by using the plus button here, and it will basically show you the same thing again. And rather than dragging, one can just click on that, and that will add a container right at the top over here. Now the first thing you notice about the container that it's clearly nothing like the dimensions that we want. So to adjust that, we go down to the bottom right over here, and we're going to set the width of that container to be this infinity sign. Now, infinity means it's going to fill as much of the space as it possibly can, which is usually dictated to by a container above it. That is the theory behind the widget tree. And on the height over here, well, I want this to be a bit adaptive, so rather than give it a fixed pixel, I'm going to alter this to be a percentage. And I think probably the right kind of percentage that we're looking at is going to be about 20%. That looks about right to me. So we have a column and we have our first container in it. Now we want to add another container, and this is the container that we're going to put into it. Initially a row and then two more containers to have the image and the form side by side. So let's put the row in followed by the container and set that to be 50% of the width. So we're going to change again the sign to the percent sign, and we're going to put in 50 there. That looks about right. And in terms of getting the height right, we're going to hit the infinity button. So that's filling as much of the space as it possibly can, as I said, being dictated to by the container above it, which we said was going to be 60%. Now, since we've got a container here, we want to put the same thing over here. The simplest way to do that is to highlight over here so that it's blue, the container, and hit Control D, which means duplicate. This is probably a good idea, good time for me to show you where those commands are found. If we go up here and press this button here, these are where you can get a quick view of all the different shortcuts that you've got. You see over here we've got duplicate widget, which was Control D. We're probably going to use all of these widgets at some moment in time, but that's how you get to see where the shortcuts are. Okay, so we've got the layout partially sorted, so let's kind of accelerate a little bit. In this container, we want to turn the background of that to black. That can be done down here, secondary background, and we're going to change it. I'm just going to change it to primary text. I think that's as close to black as I can tell. Now, the reason why I did that first is because I actually want to put it on the bottom as well. It's always a good tip just to format anything that you might copy first. That saves time in having to duplicate it later. So we're going to go up to that container that I've just turned black, and I'm going to copy it. And I'm going to paste it into the column because I want it to appear at the bottom here. So we can right click and we can paste that, and with a bit of luck we're going to see it at the bottom. So we've now got getting the layout sorted out. We've got over here we want to put in an image. It's going to select an image randomly from a royalty-free image from the internet, so we can get something a bit better. I mean, that's a little bit better. It doesn't really matter because we are going to swap that out in a minute for the actual image. Forgive me for changing the image once again, but I'm going to show you now how to swap out the online image, the royalty-free image, for the actual one that we want. Now, we have an option of using network, which means it's going to take a URL for the image, or we can actually use an asset. Now, an asset means that it is compiled in the build. So it means that if it's an APK, that image is actually going to be held on the drive of the phone. And that would be preferable if the image is static and it's never going to change. If it was something like a profile image, then one would clearly want to use a URL. One can't store them. But I would recommend that if it's a static image, it's never going to change, which is in this case, it's best to do it as an asset. And the assets are over here on the left, media assets. I have actually already uploaded that media asset into the project, which was cheating slightly, but just to show you how you do it, you simply go to the upload media. It's as simple as this. Go and find the image on your hard drive. There it is, and upload it, and then it will become available over in the project in the assets. So if we go down to assets, it says no image. No asset selected. I'm going to change that. I'm going to choose the asset that I previously uploaded. And there we go. And that looks pretty good to me. There are various options over here if it doesn't look very good, whether you're going to, for instance, define the dimensions by height. That's clearly not what we want. Width probably is correct. I might just leave it at that, even though it looks identical to this. It might be different, I think, if we change the viewport. Let's have a quick look at what happens if we change it into an iPad. No, I don't like that, actually. Let's try, let's go back to this one. So going back out to the wider viewport, we now want to start building up this form page over here. We want a sort of white border on each side, and we always want it to be centered in that particular container. And the trick here is actually, rather than adding containers straight in there, is to create a row and then add a container to that row. Even though there's only one container in that row, it has the effect of allowing us to be able to center that. And you see it's there on the left-hand side. If we scroll down onto the right-hand side, on the row, forgive me, we'll see that we've got the option of saying that we want everything in the center. Now that means that anything that goes inside this container now, which is in the center, it doesn't matter. It's going to be able to be adaptive, which is what we want. Now, in terms of getting the width of this right, so it's gone to its normal default of 100 pixels. We're going to do that as a percentage, but the percentage is actually a percentage of the whole width of the page. And since it's half a page, so say we want that to be, say, 80%. So we've got 10% and 10% on each of that side. We're actually going to put in half of that value because it's only half the width. I know that sounds a bit illogical, but it does actually work. And that's about right, although I think that is a touch on the wide side. So I'm going to reduce that maybe to 35. Let's try that. And that looks approximately right to me. And now, because we've defined this container already, then we can use the infinity sign to fill that all the way up to the top. Now, every container that we add to this container is going to be within those boundaries and leaving this white space on either side. So I'm going to move rather rapidly here. So we do just need on this viewpoint to be able to add another column so everything goes vertical. And all I'm going to do after that is to add 4 containers to it. One for the spacer, one for the heading text, one for the smaller text, and one for the email and the button. So I'm going to do that and come back. Okay, so I've made one container, width infinity, height 100, and I'm just going to Control D those till I get 4. Okay, there they are, all 4 of them. I'm going to resize them slightly. I think that one could be a little narrower. That's just the top spacer. The next one down is the heading. That is about right. The next one down is the main text, so I think that could be larger. And I am using the drag button because it's visually easier. And I think the bottom one there, because it is it's the input form, I'm going to make that a bit narrower, so we've got some space at the bottom. That looks about right to me. Now, for the text in this box, we are simply going to add the text over here, and we are going to go and look for a proper font for that. And I think probably if we'd set up everything in advance correctly, that font would already be sorted out. So it's defaulted to Hello World. We're going to change that in a minute. I think I'm going to copy and paste in the correct text into this one. I'm also going to do exactly the same for that one, and I'm going to come back when that is done. Okay, that's how it's looking at the moment. I think this bottom font is too small. Let's have a look at body medium. Let's go for body large. I still think that's a bit on the small side. Let's change the font size there to, let's try 20. That looks about right to me. Now we probably need a bit of space between these containers. So I'm going to go up to the top container and I'm going to add some padding to that at the bottom. That will ensure that it doesn't completely run into the text below it. And one can either do that, scroll up to where the padding is, we can either do all four sides, left, right, top, bottom at the same time, or one at a time. So if you click that, that will do all of four at the same time. I don't want to do that because we've already got our border sorted out, and probably 10 pixels is usually enough on that. And that you're going to notice that shifts this down, gives it a bit of space. I'm going to do the same thing for the container below it over here. I'm doing it on the container, not on the text, is typically certainly how I do it. And we'll write sort of the same convention. You could do it on the top of the one below, if that makes sense. So we'll just put 10 pixels in there, and that's going to make sure that there's some space between that and the container that's going to have the email input text and the button. So let's get on with that. Again, we're going to want to create a row because we're going to have two fields in a row, and within that row we're going to have two containers. We'll just add them really quickly like this, and we could Control D that one actually, and that will create two containers in that particular row. And for some reason the Control D didn't work. Let me do it again. And there we go. So now we've got two containers. Now they're not the right width for what we want. So in this instance, I probably would again use the handlebars. I think the email should be a bit wider, maybe that wide, and the this button container, well, that can come out. It can't come out. Shouldn't come out beyond the edge of this container. If it does, it'll do funny things, probably get truncated. So there we've got a place to put the email, and the email is going to be, so we might as well just carry on quickly and do that. That is going to be a text input, and if you want to just quickly find widgets, you can put in the name up here and it'll filter it. So it's not a text, it's actually called a text field. And so we're going to add a text field. And there we go. It says label here. We're going to change that in a minute. And into this container here, we're going to put a button. And after I've done that, I'm going to explain how we can actually format the first button to be exactly as we want, and then be able to copy the actual formatting to other buttons that we use throughout the project. But we are definitely getting there. So we're going to have to do a few formatting tricks here to make it look the way the scope did. And we're going to cover that in a minute. In the design template, we have the option of being able to create a theme widget. And that allows us to create reusable components, reusable widgets that are formatted exactly as we want. So I'm going to call this, I'm going to call it something very original, which is called button. And it is a button, so we're going to go to button here, and we're going to create that. And if we go to the scope of that button, we'll notice that it's a certain green color that we're going to insert into the color over here. So I'm just going to go and get that color. Okay, so I found the color in the scope, and the color we can put in straight in here. One could have potentially have just sort of played around randomly. There is a color palette there. So that's going to take the button to be green. Now the button has black capitals, a fairly sharp rounded corner. We've got the color right, so let's go and do that. So we'll change the corners here. They're slightly less sharp than that. We're going to maybe go for a rounded corner of 5. That looks about right. And the text is black. So we are going to go and find the text down here and change that to black. Now I've gone into a different section of the scope, and I've noticed in this particular screenshot image that the login button is white, and I'm assuming that what we really want to do is to make that go white with a black border if I either hover over it or I select it and move away. And again, that can be done within the button design template that we've just created. So I'm going to go and do that. So here, back in the button template, we've got the option of the hover style. So I'm going to put that on, and then we can now create a different hover style in this section here. So the fill color in this particular case is going to be something very close to white. So I'm going to put that in. So we're going to use that as the hover style. Now it doesn't show up here and it's not dynamic, so it is flying a little bit blind. And I want to set the border to be black. I'm going to play around with that and we're going to see how it looks in a minute. Okay, I've changed a couple of things. I've taken out the elevation over here. I've set the hover color to be white, and I've given it a border. Let's see how that works out. So now that we've set up a theme widget for a button, we can return back to our actual button over here. We're going to highlight that button, and then we're going to go up to the theme style, and we're going to choose the button like this, hopefully. And bingo, there we've got button in capitals. Now we're not going to really know whether that hovers properly or not until we actually test that out. And we can actually do that the quick way, which we haven't done yet, which is using this preview app button over there. And it's relatively fast. As I mentioned earlier, it's not going to give you any kind of functionality really, but I think it will allow us to see whether the hover is any good. And here it is. This is how it's looking, and we hover and bingo, that looks pretty accurate to me. So let's go and do the same thing for the input text field over here, because that's going to be used a lot in the scope as well. So we might as well get that sorted early on too. Okay, in a very similar fashion to creating the button theme widget, I've created an text field, input field widget. I have just changed around with some very basic things, created a border. There was an option over here as to the style of the border, whether it was underline or around, but it's fairly self-explanatory in here. And so we now have another widget theme. I then went back over to our design and I applied that widget theme up here, and I called it input field. That's the name I gave it, and I applied it and it came out looking exactly as I wanted it to be. I've also changed a few other things around here. I've played around with the fonts and the text to try and get it more accurately representing the scope. I've played around with the button, but I think we get the idea of how this works and how we use the theme widget templates. And so I think the next thing that we need to do is give it some functionality, and therefore we're going to start looking at the join the list button and how we create actions. But I think you'll agree that we're getting very, very close in our design to the scope. Now would be a good time to finish off the Firebase setup. So I've gone back to the Firebase console for our project, and we'll notice that we only have the Firestore database there. That's for small information. Now we are going to have people logging in, so we're going to want to add authentication to our project. And it's as simple as pressing that button. And in this particular case, we are doing an email and password authentication. So we're going to enable that over here, and we're just going to save those configurations. And then the other component that we want to add to our database is going to be the storage. Now, the storage is for, as I explained earlier, is for larger files, videos. We may not actually have many of those, if any of those, but it's a good part of this tutorial to add that, and there's no harm in doing so even if you don't use it. So that would complete the setup of the database, and it's creating they're called buckets, and a bucket is basically where you put large lumps of data, videos, images, that sort of thing. And actually, we probably will use that for the profile image. It's not a great idea to put images in the Firestore database. That's more about text. When it comes to something a bit larger than text, it tends to be better to put it into storage. However, it is worth pointing out that FlutterFlow does take care of most of that in the background. And if we go across to Firebase now, we will see that we didn't deploy initially the Firebase storage. Now we can do that. We do not want to manage it outside FlutterFlow. It does a perfectly good job on its own. So we're going to deploy that now that we've set it up. And again, we're going to be talking about the rules that govern what can be done with that data in that database. Again, FlutterFlow will take care of most of that, but later on we're going to lock down on the security of this application to make sure, for instance, that someone who is not an administrator cannot see an admin page, however hard they try and hack the system. And that's what the rules are all about. And there are rules for Firebase storage, and there are different rules for the Firestore database. Okay, let's have a little recap of what we're trying to do. We're going to use the button here to add an email address to the mailing list. Before we do that, we want to validate that it is a proper email address, and then we want to check to see whether that email is already in the database. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new collection, and that collection is going to be called mailing list. And there it is. And we need to add to that the place to put the actual email address itself. So we'll start from scratch. There are some templates here that can be quite useful if you're doing users, products, etc. like that, but we're going to start from scratch. And we are going to add fields straight into here. So the first field will obviously be email, and the data type of that is going to be a string, and it is not a list. Now, I probably want to add in a couple more here. I'm going to give some indication of where they joined the mailing list, whether it was on registration or whether it was on the form that we're doing now. I just think that's good practice. Okay, so there we've got a from form and a from registration. Click the box. One can carry on just literally adding fields, but we don't need to. So the from form are both Booleans. Now, very quickly, the reason why I didn't add that to the users, I could have added a new field here which would have said mailing list, but because that would have restricted only those people who were registered from joining the mailing list, and that's not part of the scope. So back to our page. We're going to highlight the button, and this is the first time we're going to create an action, and an action is created up here. If there's only one action in the chain, we can do it straight into add action, but we are going to have several. So we're going to open up the action, and the first action is going to be based on the on tap, and there are a couple of others. There's on double tap and on long press, but we're going to do the on tap, and we're going to add an action. Now, the first action that we want is to validate that it's an actual email. Now, we're going to go and do that in a second, but I want you to see first is how this builds out, because we're going to produce a Boolean. Is that a valid email or not? And we're going to say if it's not a valid email, we're going to set this here to add another action. That action is going to be an alert, an informational dialogue, and we're simply going to say, please enter a valid email address. Here we're going to create another action that is going to test whether the email is in the database already, and from there we're going to get a Boolean coming out, which is going to lead into a condition over here so that if the email is not in the database over here, we are going to have another action here. We're going to write all of these in a minute. I just wanted you to see how the structure works out, and we're going to add that to the database here. And if it is already in the database over here, we're going to add an action. We're going to add a softer action on that one, which is we're going to put a snack bar, because it doesn't need to really interrupt the experience of the user, just to tell them they've already signed up for that. So we're going to show a snack bar, and we're just going to say in here that it's already in the database. Email already on mailing list, and that's going to show for 4,000 milliseconds, which is 4 seconds. And over here, this one, as we said, is going to be the one that adds to the database. So we've got to start really creating these actions. Now, there are other ways of validating whether an email is an email or not, but I'm using this as an opportunity to start looking at actions. So that's what we're going to do now. Custom action section, which is over here, and we're going to write them. So we're going to add a custom action, and we're going to call that validate email, and we are going to use the code copilot to write that for us. The wording needs to be fairly carefully selected, but validate an email and return a Boolean would be good. Now, it is quite important to set up the return values over here in advance, because the AI will actually look at that when it's constructing the action. And so we do have a return value of a Boolean, and we've also got an input, which is the email address for it, and that is a string. And once we've got that set up, we can hit this green arrow over here, and we can let the magic begin. And it's not very many lines of code. It's simply saying if the email is empty, we're going to return false. And we are going to say that if the email fits this piece of code, which is called regex, which has been written for us, so it's fairly simple, we're going to return, if it doesn't fit that, we're going to return a false as well. And if it does, we're going to return a true. And once we've done that, we can save the action. Yes, I do want to save it. And now we can return back to our page, back to our button, back to our custom actions, go in there, and we can add the first custom action over there. And the custom action is action validate email. And that is going to return a Boolean from that. Okay, so we need to give the custom action result a name. Is email valid would seem to be fairly clear. And that can get then passed down to this condition that we're going to set. And the condition is a single condition. That is a single condition here. And the condition says that if the custom action returns, so the output is the email valid, is equal to the second value, which is a specific value of, scroll down, of, it knows it's a Boolean, of true, then we're going to go down the true avenue. We now need to create the next action here, which is to decide whether the email is or is not already in the database. So we're going to scoot across to custom actions again. Now, I've already done this one because it's really was identical in the process to the previous one, and I didn't think we needed to do it twice. I used the Copilot again to write this custom action for us, but what I have done, I've added to the custom action here exactly what I told the AI to do. And it has to be clear, so I think it's a good idea to give this an example. Query Firebase collection called mailing list and return Boolean true if it exists. And I set the input over here to be the email and the return value to be a Boolean, so that it knew that it needed to receive the email as one of the parameters. And as you can see, it's done a good job. It's basically said where email equals email. If I get a response, if a document or there's a collection with a document in there, I'm going to return is not empty. That means that the record does already exist. So back to the button actions tree. We can now set this one to be the custom action that we've generated. Does the email exist? We do need to set again over here the input value as being the email, and that comes from the widget state and the text field, so that it knows what to check. That'll remove one of our errors up here, which we were leaving to the end, see if we've got any left when we finish this. And finally, this action here is thankfully not a custom action. We can take that from the backend database here. We are going to add that record to Firestore. So Firestore, we're going to create a document, and we're going to create a document in the mailing list because we've now set that up elsewhere, and we're going to add the field email, and it's going to be not a specific value. It's going to be from a variable, and that variable again is going to be from the widget state, and it's going to be the text field of an email. Now, if you recall, we also set up a Boolean as to where it came from. Did it come from the form, or did it come from a registration? It came from the form. So we're going to edit that, and we are going to put in that a specific value, and that value is going to be true. So we're going to know where that mailing list entry actually came from. Now, the final thing that we're going to want to do here is, after that, we're going to add another action. This can be a soft action again, which is is going to be a snack, just to say that that record was successfully added. So email added to mailing list. Now, if we're going to do this really properly, we should actually possibly test to see whether that email actually was added to the database. And I'm going to show you a little technique for doing that, because even though it may not seem important in this form, it might be later on. We're going to give the output of that back-end call a result, and we'll say mailing list result, and then we can actually do a test on that. So we're going to add a condition here, and the condition is going to be a single condition, which is a single condition there, which is, and we're going to go to the action output of the mailing list result, and we're going to say that if there was a document reference generated, then so it is equal to is set, which means that it did add that record to the database, then that's going to give us a result of a true or false over here. And if it's true, we can then show the snack bar. Now, I want to move that up there, and the simplest way to do that is actually just to copy it. So we're going to copy the action there and put it there. You can't actually drag it across, and we're going to paste that action in, paste the action in. So we've got the snack bar saying that all works, and then we can remove that one. And over here, if it didn't work, we're going to add I think we should probably add a hard action, a hard alert on that one, and that alert is going to say something went wrong, please try again. Something went wrong, please try again. And at that stage, we are going to add a terminate. And so the final action here, which is show a snack bar on success, and we still have an error. So let's go and check out what this conditional action, execution action, is improperly set. So let's go and have a look at that. And it appears to be, if I highlight this one, we can see that we've got something that didn't quite like there. It doesn't seem to. Does email exist? I see my error now. It was actually in the custom action here. I did not add does email exist as the output, which now allows me to correctly define here the does email exist as an action output? Does email exist? And we can confirm that. And we've got no errors there. So that is now finished. I think we need to start testing. So we'll head out of the actions over here, and this is going to be a time to test. We're not going to use the red button because remember that doesn't give us the functionality, therefore the actions will not be triggered. We are going to use the test button, which is going to give us 28 minutes of time to make small or major changes in that in a single session, which can then be reflected in that screen in virtual real time, 5 to 10 seconds. It does take 2 to 4 minutes to compile because it's doing a proper compilation there, so we're going to put it on pause while it happens. Okay, and here we are. So we have a space for the email address. So let's deliberately put in an incorrect email address. Just put in Sam, join the list. Please enter a valid email address. Okay, that does work. Sam at test.com, tests.com, join the list. Snackbar, email added to mailing list. Okay, let's go and scoot off to Firebase and see whether it actually worked. One way of doing that is to go across to your database over here to manage your content. It takes a couple of seconds to come up, so I've done it already, pushed it over here, and I've gone down to the mailing list, and would you believe it, there we've got our sam at tests.com, and the form from the from form as opposed to from a registration is set to true. So that actually works. Now let's go back and see what happens if we try and add sam at tests.com again. Now the first thing I noticed is that sam and tests.com is still there. So I'm going to add another action that clears that field so that you get some indication of the fact that you've submitted that email. Let's just hit that and see what it says. Email already on mailing list, I should say in mailing list. So the one thing that I want to do is I want to go in and change the action for that, and I want to clear that form after the form has been submitted. So we're going to add a final action to that action tree. So it's a little bit debatable here is whether I would put it here where it would clear the form if it was in error, or it would only clear the form if it went through. I think that's a personal preference, so I'm just simply going to add another action here, and I'm going to want to clear that form. So under the widget actions here, widget interactions here, we can see clear text fields is an option, and there is only one there. It's not been very well named, and perhaps we should have named it better, but since there's only one on this form, we know that it is that text field that needs to be cleared, and we can close that. Now the beauty, as I mentioned before, of the test mode is here is that I can do an instant reload. I don't have to wait 2 to 4 minutes again, and you'll see that it's going to take a couple of seconds, and then we're going to be able to see whether indeed that also worked. Okay, so we're back here, and we're going to do max at test.com. Oh, actually, I'm going to make it so that this that the cursor is automatically put in this field because I've just missed it, which is an option. So we're going to do max at tests.com, join the list, and if that worked properly, now it's removed it there so that you know that it's actually happened. Now I did find it a bit frustrating as I thought my cursor was in that box and it wasn't. So how can we change that to make that text field in focus as soon as you open that page? I'm going to do that now. Okay, I've highlighted autofocus. Oddly, that was actually on, so it might have just been my bad typing. But that does mean that when this page is open, the cursor should already be in that box. Now, we're nearly finished with this particular page, but there is one thing that is bothering me slightly. And if we go over to our test mode, and this is what it is that if we go change the viewport on this, we can see that the join the list is being truncated, and that little sort of black and yellow stripes there means something that's called an overflow. It means that what you've got there doesn't fit in the space anymore. Now, I've thought about this quite long and hard, and I've decided that we need to do two things here. I think we need to stack this form of this image one on top of the other when we go into the smaller viewports here. And the other thing that I think we need to do in every view except for the desktop view, I think we need to move that button down to the bottom so it's underneath it. And I think the combination of those two things will make sure that the mobile version of this application is properly adapted. So I'm going to go away and do that now. So I'm going to introduce two things here, really, which is I'm going to introduce what are conditional visibilities depending on the viewport, and I'm also going to change this, which is set as a row, into something that's called a wrap. And what that means is a combination of a row and a column, which means if it can fit in a row, it'll put it in a row, and if it can't fit in a row, it's going to put it in a column. And fortunately, one of the things that you can now do that's been recently added to FlutterFlow is that if we go and find I'll call it the offending row, we're going to want to swap that out for a wrap. So there's the row. It used to be a bit tricky to change that because you'd have to take into consideration all of its children. But now they've rather beautifully made this very easy. So we can replace that widget, and we're going to replace it with there it is, with a wrap. Now with a little bit of luck, this is going to do what we want. And it won't look any different from this viewport, but what happens if we go into a smaller viewport? Let's go into the iPad. Okay, it's not well formatted, but it actually has done it. What about if we go into the an iPhone? Is that we're still going to have enough space? It's getting a bit small. No, it's getting a bit small, that space, because the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stack these images so that they get at least the full width of it. But there needs to be a bit of formatting, I think, on that wrap. And I'm probably just going to assume that that's a lot of common sense going on with putting in the spacing correctly, getting the padding right on it. So I might just do that, and if I come across anything a bit complicated, I'll come back into the video and explain. But I'm just going to play around with the formatting of that. Now, the second thing that we want to do is, let's just go back to the wide viewport here, is that we want the image to stack on top of the form. Keep doing that, sorry. On top of the form when it gets narrow. And I think that viewport looks okay. If we go to this one, I think it looks okay. There, I don't think that anyway, it's a good opportunity for us to look at some of this responsive viewport options that we've got over here. Now, if we're in the narrow view of it at the moment, if I go and press that button there, this is whether it's visible or not in that view. In fact, I'm not highlighting actually I want to highlight the container, the major container of this, which I think is this one, so that the whole of that vanishes. You can see that it's disappeared. Yet if I go into a different viewport, it is there. Okay, so go back to iPad, it comes back again because it's only going to affect the upright version, the portrait version of the mobile phone. And then what we can do is go and do the same thing in reverse. We can copy that picture into a column and copy that form into a column, and then we'll set that one to be on and all the other ones to be off. All right, it's a little trick, but it does actually work quite well, and it's effectively saying we're going to give you a different layout depending on the viewport. Now I think I'm just going to explain that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do it and probably come back because I think I've explained it possibly well enough for you to get at least the principle of what I'm talking about here by simply saying that we're going to create, copy this picture and that form. Instead of it being in a row, we're going to put it into a column and make it in a column form when the viewport of that is narrow. Now, one thing that we should get into the habit of doing is naming these containers to be what they are, because I'm going to copy that and it's going to copy it down to the bottom, and if they're all called container, I'm going to get a bit confused, so I'm just going to rename them so we can see what's going on. And we can do that over here by just putting the pencil, and we can still leave the container there, but I'm going to call container, I'm going to be very lazy, I'm going to call it M for middle. And then I'm going to change that M T top, M B for bottom. Okay, so I've changed that actually to container middle row. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to Control D that. So now we've got two container M rows, rename one to column. Set the visibility of the row not to be visible in the case of the mobile phone, and the column to only be visible. So we get rid of those three there if it's in a narrow view of a phone. Swap out that row there for a column. Okay, I'm getting there. I've had to do a bit of jiggery pokery on this, but we've got a middle column here with two containers in it, 50% or 30%. It's 50% of the available space left, which is 30%. And I'm going to put the image in here and the form in here. Okay, getting there. Obviously, this needs to be formatted so it's wider and the text is smaller. Decided to make the top and bottom containers invisible. I don't think they're necessary anymore for the mobile view. Okay, after a bit of playing around, I managed to get the mobile phone to look like this and the desktop to look like this. But we have a couple of errors up here, and I know what they are. The problem is that it literally says what it is. The action output variable are the same for two buttons, because we've got two pages effectively here. Because I copied this form in, then this action has also been copied across, and we need to go in. And whenever there is an action output value here, is email valid, I'm just going to change it to email valid 1. And then obviously we need to change the input where it uses the email valid 1 to email valid 1. I'm just going to go through the whole action tree and redo that. So for instance here we need to swap that out there as well for is email valid 1, etc. Okay, I've gone through them all, and the errors have gone, and I suspect I also know what the warnings are. They probably want us to validate our custom code once more. That's just a quick question of clicking that button and letting it do it. And the Firestore rules set up, well, we can go and have a look. They're warnings. We're not too worried about them at the moment. And that really ends the first page. Now, the next page I'm going to do is going to be much more rapid, because I'm not going to repeat any of the tutorial of the first page. I'm just going to introduce the new things and assume and hope that the tutorial up until that point will have given you enough insight in how to work out how to do them for a new page. So let's get on with the second page now.